Okay, so we are now on page 104. What's interesting to look at here is the way that Stanley juxtaposes with the other men in the room, okay? And that's emphasised through the sounds as well. So there is no sound but that of Stanley steadily shuffling the cards, okay? So the adverb steadily is showing us how he is still in complete control. And remember that he is remorseless as well, whereas the other men are described here. So Mitch keeps staring down at his hands on the table. So we've said just before, he's upset, he's feeling guilty, and the other men look at her curiously. Okay, they're clearly have never seen anything like this before. Stanley, however, is still in complete control. The stage directions for Blanche show us how unwell she is. Okay, so she enters the flat with a peculiar smile, her eyes wide and brilliant. Okay, she's attempting to find some way to escape this situation that she's in. And we can really see Stella's despair. She closes her eyes and clenches her hands. Eunice, throughout this whole scene, is trying to comfort Stella, trying to make her feel better about what she's done. So she does throw her arms comfortingly about her. As ever, adverbs really important in the stage directions for demonstrating character reactions. At the end of this block of stage directions, Stanley suddenly pushes back his chair and rises as if to block her way. So as ever, Stanley is really alert for his prey. Remember, this is exactly what he did in scene 10. He blocks her exit from the apartment, and we can see him doing the same thing again. The interrogative is really confrontational, isn't it, at this point in time? Everybody else is aware how kind of like awkward and uncomfortable this whole situation is, whereas Stanley is in complete control and he's willing to challenge her. Blanche speaking shrilly, okay, and repeating things and having exclamatives, all showing us her complete panic in this situation. Stage direction is really interesting again here, okay, the lurid reflections which appear on the walls in odd sinuous shapes, almost exactly the same stage directions that we saw for the rape in scene 10. What this means is that just like in scene 10, okay, the audience can hear what's in Blanche's mind and we can see it as well. So this plastic theatre and this kind of expressionist way of using the sounds and the staging really helps to evoke sympathy for Blanche at this point in time. Potentially, the way that the Varsuviana is filtered into a weird distortion and accompanied by the cries and noises of the jungle. Remember, the Varsuviana is the trauma from Alan's death, and the cries and the noises of the jungle are what could be heard as Stanley was raping her. So potentially those two things have merged as traumatic events, and they've created these distortions in her mind. Again, Williams is showing us the kind of mental instability of Blanche. The verb seizes is really showing us her escalating panic and the fact that she feels that she needs to defend herself. This is all going to be really reminiscent of scene 10 for the audience as well and make us feel real pity for Blanche. Okay. Stanley, still in control, telling the doctor what to do. Doc, you better go in. And then this description of the matron is interesting and obvious, clear contextual links to Rose. Okay, so the matron advances on one side with Stanley on the other. Okay, so Stanley is there making sure that Blanche gets her comeuppance, making sure that she is removed from the flat. The matron is divested of all the softer properties of womanhood, and she is a peculiarly sinister figure in her severe dress. Okay, so those adjectives are really creating a negative impression of her. Her voice is bold and toneless as a fire bell. Okay, so that simile is really showing us that she is not a compassionate person. She is just very, remember the word before was like cynically detached, so this is just a job for her. When the matron then greets her, hello Blanche, we get these greetings echoed and re-echoed by other mysterious voices behind the walls, as if reverberated through a canon of rock. So again, typical Williams-esque descriptive and symbolic use of stage directions. And we need to think about what all these mysterious voices, which then speak on the next page, represent. And for me, I think what they're showing us is that we've got this cruel reality that's presented to us by Stanley and by the matron. And the fact that then these kind of echoes and these voices come in, they represent the fact that that cruel world, that kind of brutal, remorseless, detached world that we see in Stanley and the matron is also echoed in the wider world. So what Williams is doing is he's making it clear the kind of symbolic significance of these characters. Okay, next page. So this is the first time I think that we get an interaction between Stanley and Blanche since scene 10, and you can see that Stanley is using interrogatives to kind of challenge Blanche. So what did you forget, Blanche? Blanche can't even respond to that. We get the repetition of I and the dashes showing us that she's completely incoherent at this point. The matron, a little bit like Stanley, is grammatically incorrect. It don't matter. It should be it doesn't matter. So potentially that's placing her in the same kind of socioeconomic group as Stanley and creating that contrast with Blanche. Look at Stanley's short sentence. Sure, we can send it along with the trunk. Okay, he's really got this sort of like detached, in control self in this scene. And that is in such contrast to the way that Blanche is retreating in panic, repeating herself, I don't know you, I don't know you. Look at all the dashes as well. It's like absolutely desperate. And the exclamatives at the end when she is pleading with them. The matron's now Blanche sounds very much kind of like teacherly in the way that you would speak to a child. And then we get the echoes of the previous stage directions that come in. Now Blanche, now Blanche, now Blanche. Okay. Like I was just saying, I think potentially that's emphasizing that it's not just the matron and Stanley that are against her. She's set up in opposition to the entire world as it stands, the whole of New America. But it could also, of course, just be emphasizing the complete crisis that she's in. Stanley, again, critical of Blanche. She left nothing here but spilt talcum and empty perfume bottles. The spilt talcum powder and the empty perfume bottles are also things that we associate with femininity. And that really shows us his kind of contempt for her constructed sense of femininity. Obviously, this next little bit that happens is really symbolically important in terms of the light. Unless it's a paper lantern you want to take with you, you want the lantern. Look again at the interrogative and how confrontational he's choosing to be. These stage directions are super important next. So he crosses to the table, seizes the paper lantern, tearing it. So you've got that verb showing us his aggression off the light bulb and extends it towards her. She cries out as if the lantern was herself. Okay, what Williams is doing with the stage directions there is magnifying the symbolism. Okay, we know that she's avoided light the whole way through, when Stanley pulls the lantern off, that's like another violation of Blanche. So again, like we've said about Stanley the whole way through in these last couple of scenes, even though he knows that Blanche is delusional and Blanche is vulnerable, he is completely remorseless in the way that he treats her. Okay, the comments that he just had about the spilt talcum and empty perfume bottle also links into the fact that he can't stand her vanity, and the way that he pulls the paper lantern down, I think, is showing us that he doesn't care for her fragility either. Again, there's that contrast between the other men and Stanley, because all of the other men spring to their feet, okay? They're completely unnerved by this, and they react to it. Stella runs out onto the porch, with Eunice following again to comfort her. And then we can see both in the stage directions and in what Stella says, Stella's complete despair. Oh my God, Eunice, help me. Don't let them do that to her. Okay, so we've got all of these repetitions. We've got the blasphemy. We've got all of the O's. We've got the exclamatives, all showing her desperation. Then she tries to break free from Eunice's arms. So obviously there's a sense of her that wants to be able to go and help Blanche and rescue her. Eunice, pragmatic as ever, suggests that she just doesn't look, okay? Because as we know, and we spoke about last lesson, Eunice is pragmatic about this all. She knows that Stella needs the social protection of marriage, and what she's suggesting is that she just needs to get rid of Blanche so that she can be safe, basically. Stella's use of pronouns is important. The fact that she starts referring to her as my sister, and again she's repeating herself. What have I done to my sister? Oh God, what have I done to my sister? I think I mentioned this last lesson, okay, but given what the audience sees of Eunice and Stella's suffering, it seems unlikely that they believe nothing of Blanche's story. Okay, remember, we've seen both of them experience that domestic violence. However, this is the key part to it, okay? When Eunice says it was the only thing you could do, okay, what she's suggesting is that a woman's only way of survival is a man. It doesn't matter really whether it's true or lie, a truth or a lie that Stanley raped her. They both need to dismiss it in order for them to survive. And then right at the bottom, we have got Stanley in control again. Hey, doctor, you better go in. Okay, so he is really making sure that Blanche gets taken away, and he's even telling the doctor what to do. He's so in control. And this is where we get potentially the only little bit of redemption, I think, in the scene, which is when Mitch attempts to challenge Stanley. Okay, so throughout the whole scene, Mitch has been really downtrodden, basically, and then this is the point when he sees this happening to Blanche. This is the point at which he becomes desperate and he starts to react. Okay, Mitch actually attempts to go into Blanche, so he started towards the bedroom. Stanley is taking control physically again. Look, this is the third time that he's blocked somebody trying to get through the space. Mitch is speaking wildly, and he absolutely blames Stanley. So you, okay, look at that minor sentence in the exclamative with the second person totally challenging him. You done this, or you're goddamn interfering with things, you. Okay, so he's attempting to challenge him, but look, he doesn't even get to finish his sentence. That dash is showing us that he's interrupted. And what Stanley does is he kind of puts him down very much in the way that he does at the opening of the scene, suggesting that he's a crybaby and a mummy's boy. Quit the blubber, okay? And that's important because it's suggesting that an emotional response to this is completely unreasonable, and he's really enforcing that kind of sense of male detachment. But Mitch is not quite so easily pushed aside, which is what Stanley tries to do. So he says, I'll kill you. Clearly, what that's showing us is that he had feelings for Blanche, and he is devastated that it didn't work out. He responds with physical aggression. He lunges and strikes at Stanley. I mean, I think in the audience we're going to be pleased to see this happen. But Stanley takes control. Hold this boneheaded crybaby. Okay, so again, coming back to the sense that showing emotion is in some way weakness and just absolutely putting him down. What happens, unfortunately, is that the other men, Steve and Pablo, reinforce Stanley's alpha male status, and they grab hold of Mitch and make sure that he stops. So then all that Mitch does is collapse at the table in a sobbing mess. So just kind of reinforces the despair and the pity in this scene. At this point on the stage, the matron is pinning Blanche down. Okay, so we're really at the kind of tragic moment of the play. Blanche is crying out hoarsely, but the matron really again is shown to have that kind of detachment, so these fingernails have to be trimmed. She's only thinking of himself. And then obviously she asks for the straight jacket doctor. The doctor, thankfully, is a little bit more compassionate than the matron, okay, and he's not willing to do that unless he has to. And this is where he changes. He becomes personalized, gentle, reassuring, okay? And he calls her by her full name, Miss Dubois. And he seems to here to kind of personify the polite southerner of her dreams, okay? He is the gentleman that she recognizes, and therefore she consents to go with him. She also, though, stares at him with desperate pleading, okay? He has now become the person who she's going to pin all of her hopes on. Some people think that at this point in the play, Blanche kind of accepts the reality of her situation. However, the kind of desperation and the fact that she pins all of her hopes on him really makes her not especially different to how she's behaved in the rest of the play, when she's kind of depended on men to look after her. And she, you know, she talks on the next page, we get that key quote, "I've always depended on the kindness of strangers," but that hasn't really worked out for her. There is a sense that Blanche is kind of fading away at this point because she responds faintly, "Ask her to let go of me." But in contrast to that, okay, she is speaking in a declarative. She is attempting in a very weak way to establish some control. Contextually, in many of his plays, Williams depicts unmarried, fallen Southern women as victims to society's rules. And the desperate nature of Blanche's situation is seen in her attempt to convince herself that the chivalric gent still exists in the form of Shep and then in the form of the Doctor here. And her determination to depend on the kindness of strangers indicates the kind of resignation and defeat that women in her situation had to accept. So let's look at that on the next page. Sorry, there's a lot of scribbling here. Okay, contextually, right, social convention in the Old South diminished unmarried women. They were really completely insignificant, okay, and that therefore left them vulnerable to being dominated or destroyed by men. And that's exactly what we see with Stanley and Blanche. What that shows us is the triumph of brutality and ruthlessness over Blanche's gentility and delicacy. And what I think Williams is showing us is just how disposable her feminine delicacy is in this culture. The Doctor, thankfully, at top of the page takes control and orders the matron to let go, okay? And then the whole kind of gentlemanly aspect happens here, in that Blanche extends her hands towards the Doctor and he draws her up gently and supports her. And she kind of holds on tight to his arm. It's almost like they're about to go out for a Sunday walk, okay? We need to talk about this quote: "Whoever you are, I have always depended on the kindness of strangers." So some people think, like I said, she's bravely facing up to her failed life, and that this is kind of like a dignified way for her to leave the scene, that she walks out with composure. She isn't dragged out in a straitjacket. She knows that he's not Shep, okay, so that maybe reinforces this idea that she's facing up to her failed life. But this is also terribly ironic, because nobody has ever shown her kindness in her life. She has depended on men the whole way through her life, and it hasn't been kindness. You know, they've been looking for sex. And even Stella hasn't shown her kindness, so even her sister. So yes, we can say it's terribly ironic, but we can also say that she does leave with some dignity and composure. We can also see that this is a very bleak portrayal of, this is this bit up here, William's vision of man, okay? That we are isolated and we are vulnerable, and by man I mean mankind, okay, rather than men. What he's emphasizing is the importance of passion, and he inspires pity for those without family on one hand, but it also serves as a warning that any of us are going to have to depend on the kindness of strangers. You know, as we get older, we will all be in clinical institutions depending on the kindness of strangers, so there is a universality to it. Okay, as I said before, it's also ironic. He's not Shep, and her dependence on strangers has led to her downfall. You know, she has been denied sympathy the whole way through. So this idea that she's going to get kindness from strangers potentially shows her continuing detachment from reality. So two different ways you can look at it, really. And ideally, if you were writing an essay at it, you would look at both of them. So then I think what we finish with here is really the reality of Stella. So Eunice descends to Stella and places a child in her arms. Okay, so she is now firmly bound to Stanley. Stella is the person who is now trapped. Interestingly, it is a blue blanket, so it is a little boy, reinforcing the fact that she's in this male world. She accepts the child sobbingly, so we need to think about who the tears are for at this point, okay? So yes, she's shedding tears for her sister. I think she's devastated about what she's just done to her. But there's also a kind of complexity here, a tension between illusion and reality, between Blanche's story and between her understanding of her life. So let me just move this down a little bit. She can't believe Blanche's story, but she also can't deny it. So I think here, when she's sobbing with inhuman abandon, and she gives this real surrender to her crying. She's crying for herself, she's crying for Blanche, she's crying about what she's done for Blanche. On one hand, she feels trapped, but on another hand, perhaps she also feels relieved that Blanche is gone, that she can go back to living this delusional life. And then we get this really horrible moment with Stanley, okay? So he's really like over the top in the way that he tries to comfort her, voluptuously, soothingly. And we get all of this repetition, okay? So now, honey, now, love, now, love. Okay, he kneels beside her and his fingers find the opening of her blouse. Obviously, the audience are going to be remembering his rape of Blanche in the previous scene. And the way that he gropes her is going to make us think about the way that he took advantage of Blanche, and make us think that he's potentially taking advantage of Stella's vulnerability here. We're absolutely going to see that the only way really that he knows to respond to things is with sex. The way that he gropes her, and that's the last impression that we get of him, really contrasts with the last impression that we had of Blanche. Okay, Blanche manages to take an exit that creates real pathos. She has some dignity and composure, although there's irony in what she says. Okay, we're just left with this image of Stanley's brutality. Stella accepts his comforting, okay, this overdone comfort, and potentially that's because it confirms to the script that she needs, that life has to go on. Also, the way that he is fixated with sex and his crudeness is showing us the way that he personifies male dominance. I'm going to post you some stuff about the 7-card stud game because it's quite lengthy to explain. Last thing, if you're still listening, well done. Okay, so the play ends with Stanley trapped in another fantasy. Oh, sorry, I'm losing the plot now. No, the play ends with Stella trapped in another fantasy. At first, she seems more pragmatic and realistic, but as the play progresses, we see that she is not able to accept the excessive violence that comes with the vitality and passion of her life with Stanley. Perhaps we feel more sympathy for her as she doesn't understand the gritty reality of nature like Blanche. Okay, remember we talked previously that even when Blanche is constructing these fantasies about Mitch, she still has an awareness of the gritty reality. She still, she shows really great understanding of human beings and of universal truths all the way through the play. Stella does not have that. Who you sympathise with more then is subjective. This critic was suggesting that makes us sympathise with Stella more, but maybe that just means that Stella's ignorant and actually we sympathise with Blanche more. It's also important at the end that the more chivalrous ways of the upper classes give way to the rougher, coarser ways of the working classes. So kind of symbolically, the working classes win out.